Right, good morning. Welcome again to the second annual War Studies Conference. I'm Colonel Bill Ostland and the Director of Military Instruction at West Point. Before I hand the floor over to Major Rick Moncalm, the MC of the conference, I just want to say a few words. Our 47-month military program aims to build the capacity and confidence in our future commissioned officers to evolve with the U.S. Army and ideally ahead of our adversaries. We prepare our future officers for service in an ever-changing spectrum of conflict that we believe will include even more complex and unpredictable battlefields. In addition to the academic year education and training, each summer we turn the woods near West Point into a training ground that allows us to train and evaluate the cadets' military skills and leadership abilities in a wide variety of conditions and scenarios. Germane to the theme of this conference, we are training and educating our future officers how to practice civ-mil relations at the tactical level, from working with host nation leaders in distrusting populations to disrupting criminal activities. It's important to recognize that our frontline soldiers include highly educated individuals that couple their education with very well-resourced pre-deployment training and immersion experiences in deployed locations. When the 173rd Airborne Brigade parachuted into Iraq in 2003, 15 field grade officers, majors and above, were on the manifest. 13 had master's degrees, 2 had multiple master's degrees, 3 had taught at this institution, and 1 was an Olmsted Scholar. The graduate schools included Harvard, Tufts, Johns Hopkins, Cornell, King's College, and Vanderbilt. I share this example to note that our military officers are not just the best trained in the world and likely the most experienced, but they also possess a level of intellectual talent unseen in our history. This experience and intellectual talent is important and affects the civ-mil relations. Samuel Adams noted in the 1770s that soldiers are apt to consider themselves as a body distinct from the rest of citizens. We need and respect civilian oversight and also civilian bodies that offer differing perspectives and point out our flaws. We also need military leaders who will push back on civilians and offer their best military advice. Last evening, General Clark discussed civ-mil in high command. I'll close with a more tactical anecdote. Shortly after parachuting into Iraq, the 173rd Airborne Brigade had a young British civilian embedded in Kirkuk province. Many of you are probably familiar with Miss Emma Skye. We didn't always see the world the same, but I want to underscore the importance of this relationship. To have a civilian who understood the Arab mind, who saw us differently, and provided us with an unvarnished feedback was invaluable to our efforts in Kirkuk province. Further, Miss Skye had a direct link to her British superior, who was a counterpart to Paul Bremer, then the director of CPA. This web of civ-mil relations allowed us to be more effective than was possible for others that lacked such relations. After 2 months in Kirkuk, emboldened by our initial successes, the 173rd's executive officer and I, the operations officer, visited the CPA headquarters in an effort to get support for a number of province initiatives. As we entered the first CPA office responsible for air and rail transportation, we quickly introduced ourselves and the ideas we had to advance our efforts in Kirkuk. A 20-something civilian employee looked at us with exasperation and said, "We just wouldn't understand." And I interrupted and I said, as a PhD candidate from Fletcher, with a counterpart who possesses a degree, a master's in economics from the Colorado School of Mines, and 3,500 human sensors embedded in Kirkuk for the last 2 months, what won't we understand? Our host, a student on leave from a state master's program, stammered and reassessed the military officers in his office. And like conversations were replicated throughout our CPA visit. My point is not to compare academic credentials, but that it is important to close the Civ Mill cultural gap in this country, which tends to seesaw back and forth between infatuation and distrust. In Emma Skye's book, The Unraveling, she provides, and I quote, "Colonel Mayville brought me into his inner circle, the closed club of the Army. In response, I rolled up my sleeves, knuckled down, and adapted to working within their culture. I mastered the rank structure, the fist bumps, the jokes, and the code. I realized that the military was from Mars, but I studied it, found shared values and objectives, and learned how to work with it. I came to appreciate its organization, its bureaucracy, its leadership, and resources. I found it could be flexible, adaptable, and a quick learner. Importantly, the soldiers generally wanted to do the right thing," unquote. I certainly appreciated the advice and contacts that Ms. Skye provided us in Iraq, and eventually the support of CPA. But I note the learning effort and trust have to go in both directions. It's equally important that civilians put the same energy into understanding what the military brings to the complex environments we share. And that is more than tanks, planes, helicopters, and bases that provide secure support facilities. The country that draws too great a distinction between its scholars and its soldiers runs the risk of having its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. Although the author of this observation is in question, the essence of this thought is not. I'm looking forward to this conference and learning what you all have to say on this topic. With that, I'll hand the floor over to Major Rick Moncomb, who will introduce the first panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see everybody made it back from Patton's Tavern last night. Before we kick off the first panel, we'll go over a few administrative notes to get you started. For anybody that needs it, just in the back corner, we have a charging station for any electronic devices you have. And if you're not already connected to the Wi-Fi, it should pop up as War Studies, and the passcode is Duty, Honor, Country, all lower caps, and all one word. As we move into the Q&A portion of all of our panels, the placards you have in front of you, if you'd like to ask a question, please just turn it vertically, and the moderator will recognize you, and we'll get a microphone to you to ask your questions. With that, our first panel, Divided We Stand, Pathologies, Politics, and the Profession of Arms, that will begin here in just a moment. After the panel, we'll have a short break, and then we'll move directly into our second panel, Revisiting Huntington's The Soldier and the State for Today's Wars. After the second panel, we will break for lunch at the West Point's Hudson Club. Our first panel is moderated by Dr. Dominic Tierney of the Atlantic Monthly and Swarthmore College. Dr. Tierney.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here and moderate the first panel at this exciting conference. I'm Dominic Tierney from Swarthmore College, and I'm also a contributing editor at The Atlantic. This is my first trip to West Point, and I'm reading Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses Grant. Many of you are probably familiar with it, which describes Grant's time at West Point and the illustrious company that he had, including Stonewall Jackson, Sherman, McClellan, Pickett, many others. And the lesson I took from this is that if you come to West Point, you never know who you're sitting next to and what they will achieve. And sometimes it's the most unassuming individual who go on to do the greatest things. So a couple of just quick things, logistical things. This is on the record. And if everyone can just silence their cell phones, please, that would be great. So I'm just going to introduce the panelists first, and then we can get on to the main event as quickly as possible. Marybeth Ulrich is Professor of Government in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. James Dubik is a professor at Georgetown University's Security Studies program and a senior fellow at the Institute for the Study of War. Phillip Carter is Senior Fellow and Director of the Military, Veterans, and Society Program at the Center for a New American Security. Charles Dunlap is a Professor of the Practice of Law at Duke Law School and Executive Director of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security. And Elizabeth Stanley is an Associate Professor of Security Studies with joint appointments in Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government. So the plan is that each panelist is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll try to keep pretty strictly to that. And then I'll ask the panelists a few questions, probably for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. So without further ado, Marybeth, Ulrich, perhaps could go first. Thank you.
So I was asked to give a lay of the land outlining the historical norms of civil mill and how they have been evolving as sort of a context for all this. So I decided to discuss the constitutional foundations of our civil mill norms, highlight a few norms that have been eroding, and then discuss how the erosion is linked to the ever-growing civil-military gap. So beginning with constitutional foundations, and what a great room and building to do that in. So I think this often gets lost in the discussion, and we always have to start with this. So the most fundamental historical civil-military relations norm is to uphold the democratic processes enshrined in the Constitution. As I stated in The Future of the Army Profession, the military profession's first obligation is to do no harm to the state's democratic institutions and the democratic policy-making processes they establish. Our founders had the first word on U.S. civil-military relations when they ordered, when they established the civil-military order in the Constitution. Many of the checks and balances were related to their goal of ensuring civilian control. This may seem elemental, but it seems that much of the debate about civil-military relations norms relate back to this thread of civilian control as a pillar of our democratic system. So as we discuss throughout the conference the various behaviors that conform more or less with civil-military norms, especially when considering civil-military relations through an institutional lens, I challenge you to consider if the behavior in question may undermine civilian control. Because at its most basic conceptualization, civilian control means that the elected representatives of the people decide. Understanding civil-military relations in this respect goes beyond just averting coups to recognize that some forms of policy advocacy, insisting, and policy veto undermine civilian control. Turning to the sociological lens, the historical roots of the U.S. Armed Forces and society relationship are also enshrined in the Constitution, in the principle of the common defense. I will return to this principle at the end of my remarks in the context of the civil-military gap. So now that we've taken a look at our constitutional foundations, let's take a look at how they have been evolving and eroding. Before I go into a few that I've selected, I have to say that I think the biggest problem with civil-military relations norms is that they are poorly understood. There is a lack of common understanding of civil mill norms in the military, within the civilian political leadership, and within society in general. Members of the military profession are inadequately and unevenly formed in this area. Civilians don't have enough of a shared understanding of the norms. Civilians can't enforce and maintain civil military norms if they don't understand what they are or their critical civilian oversight role. So with that, the first one that I'll highlight is this whole apolitical, nonpartisan norm. This, contributing to the lack of understanding here, is the conflation of a variety of terms: nonpartisan, apolitical, policy, political. So it depends what you're talking about. We have to be specific with our terms. I can't go into all the details on that, but this is something I would be talking about on lesson 1 where I was trying to teach this. But a principled officership requires adherence to an ethic of non-partisanship. I'll return to this a little bit in my second norm. General Clark mentioned last night the rise of the affiliation with the Republican Party. He said that had been going on all along. However, I would argue, and I think the data shows, that what changed was identifying as independents to moving over to those independent identifications, which had been 2/3, to identifying with the Republican Party. So that may or may not be a big deal to people, but it's certainly a change, and we have to look into that. And at least we can say there's been a very long distance from the days of George T. Marshall, who advocated not voting at all, to the days of partisan campaigning, at least on the part of retired officers, and this idea that Jason Dempsey, I'm going to shout out to him, in his book, Our Army, said something along the lines that, according to his research, it's as if an officer's identity now is tied up with being a Republican. So that's not so much who gives me a bigger defense budget as there's more tied in with that. And again, his research is great on what are the nuances wrapped up with that. But I would argue that the more political an institution becomes, since politics is about seeking influence, the more political institution becomes, the more it will become focused on exercising that influence. Another consequence is that instead of staying above the political fray, members of the military have become part of this polarized society. And I think there are many implications of this, but there's one that I would like to point out, and I see this actually in my interaction with some of our war college students, is where do they get their information? So if they're part of this polarized society, it seems to me a lot of them, based on their in-class discussion, they are getting them not from a variety of sources, not from balanced sources. And so then they lack the balanced, objective sources, the background they need to render their best military advice against an accurate sort of political environment. Next norm I'll highlight is the norm for a limited role in policymaking. So this limited role should be restricted to giving the best military advice, not their best political advice, for which they have insufficient expertise. But increasingly, military actors are operating as political actors in the policy space. This is exacerbated in the current administration, where military actors hold the lion's share of political expertise, where the real experts are disdained for being experts, and where there is a vacuum of civilian political expertise in key departments. There are not a lot of Emma Skies running around either Department of State or Department of Defense. The third norm I would like to highlight is the behavior of retirees, especially senior flag rank retirees. So the variety of areas, everywhere from the endorsements that we're all familiar with, but also to the role in trying to influence policy from the outside, perhaps competing with active duty in some sense, and cashing in rank and position to get lucrative retirement, post-retirement options versus serving society in roles that are not as well compensated. Now, what's the civil mil angle on this? I would argue to the extent to which officers may be positioning themselves on active duty to be selected for such opportunities, that would be a problem. So the backdrop of all of this, which I think makes all these trends worse, is the civil-military gap. And as I mentioned at the outset, the erosion of the founding principle of the common defense. So we've had several generations of the all-volunteer force now has resulted in the present-day warrior caste, a far cry from the common defense goal set forth at the founding. So we know that story, self-selecting from particular regions, certain demographics over-represented. So increasingly, it's a military not representative of the people, increasingly separate from the people. As an aside, I've been doing some research on the Baltic states' policies and measures that they are undertaking to encourage a whole-of-society contribution to defense, something they call total defense, to the American trend, which is in the opposite direction. So I would argue we can learn from some of these tiny countries that are really fighting to save their democracy, where their view of the common defense is alive and well, where they've brought back conscription, they regularly train reserves, they have defense leagues where the whole of society participates in, they focus on building resilience in society and patriotic education across the society. Meanwhile, back in the West, in the West in general, in the US, there's an erosion of the obligation for national service and a willingness to fight for democratic norms, which may threaten the sustainability of democracy. This is particularly troubling in light of the evolving strategic environment and the increasing potential for great power war. Is this something that could be fought with a warrior caste? The institutional lens of the civil military gap focus on the growing expertise gap. General Clark noted how President Trump likes the legitimacy that the generals in the administration give him. This is resulting in a new pattern of U.S. civil military relations. playing out against the backdrop of civil mil expertise gap that has been growing. So over time, we've seen the following trends. Political leaders' national security expertise is lower. Congress's national security expertise is lower. Society's national expertise is lower. Our overall national security discourse is weak. This is about other environmental factors such as low information and misinformation. So we need to increase civic education, civic mindedness, and the general familiarity with these issues across society. So to sum up, this all adds up to a shift in the United States from civil-military relations to military-civilian relations. Society is increasingly comfortable with the military becoming the go-to institution to, quote-unquote, get things done, or save us from civilians who don't have the national interest at heart, they think, like the military does, or so the argument goes, or who can't compete with the military's expertise. So anyone who has ever read Samuel Finer's The Man on Horseback should be concerned about these trends and their diversion from the founders' attempt to order our civil-military relations otherwise.
Thanks, Chuck, for inviting me to the conference. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back here. I taught for 3 years in the English department. I was, I guess you would call it at-risk acquisition. Colonel Stromberg was the deputy director of the English department at the time. He called me up. I was the adjutant of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. And he said, Jim, your grades, your GREs are low. You're going to have to take them over. And I said, no, sir. And he said, what do you mean, no, sir? And I said, well, look, I spent 3.5 years in the 82nd and 3.5 years in the 2nd Ranger Battalion. My vocabulary has not expanded. So let me make a deal with you. Let me get into some graduate schools, and if they're of the quality that you accept, send the money and I'll follow the money. So that happened. He sent the money to Johns Hopkins. I went to Johns Hopkins. So I get back here, but he really wanted to know how I did that. To, I guess, either prevent other people from screwing up his system or what, I don't know. But I'm forever grateful to Colonel Stromberg and Colonel Capps for taking the risk on me and for the service here where the profession really comes to the fore in almost every day's discussions and activities. So in preparation for the panel, I did an informal poll. Now, I'm Polish, so I can't do anything else except have a poll. So I sent some questions, 3 questions, to about a dozen of my friends. And these are 3. Now, of course, my poll is not scientific, not representative, absolutely not random, but it might be illustrative. Here are the 3 questions. First, why do the American people have such high confidence in our profession, especially because they know so little about it? Second question, what could we do as members of the profession to erode that confidence? And then third, do you see any evidence that we're on a path of erosion, even if it's just a little bit? And so I sent that out and naturally got some stuff back. In sum, the group believed the following. One, that the confidence is derived from their belief, and this is going to sound familiar, their belief that the military is an apolitical, in a partisan sense, apolitical professional organization that works, that gets things done. Second, that the confidence can be eroded. And then there were some themes, a couple of themes I'll talk about. And third, that in some areas, that erosion has already begun. So that was my random, unscientific, non-representative result. So let me get into some of the details. First, as to the first question. There were 2 themes. The main theme was, of course, that we're apolitical and we get things done. This group thought that, in general, the American people believed that we do offer the best military advice, even if it dissents from the rhetoric coming out of either the media or Congress or the White House or any place else. Second, that we are, in fact, a results-oriented profession, and that most people think that we're reliable, that we're selfless in our leadership, that what we do has the country's best interest in mind, not just what's good for the military, that senior military leaders are not yes men or women, they're not politically motivated, and they generally follow the direction of elected officials. Even after arguing with them, they disagree with the decision. And then last, I think that's, yeah, with respect to the first theme, that we not only got things done, but we got things done according to a code of ethics that we enforce upon ourselves. And this was, again, their answer, the main theme and the answer to their first question. But they had a secondary theme that emerged from my informal poll, and that is that the lack of familiarity contributed to the confidence. And so this kind of gives me pause. If you're confident in something you don't know much about, this is, not very well-founded confidence. And this group thought that, of course, they didn't, American people don't know much about its military, and so they support it more out of like a social expectation than a reality-based judgment. And that's a pretty weak foundation. So then we get on to the second question, what could we do? Could we do anything to erode this? And their answer, of course, was yes. And with respect to the first theme, they said, look, if we, there were three major answers. If we politicize in the partisan political sense, the officer corps, this will start to erode confidence. They understood, each of the people I referred to, they understand that there's always politics, especially at the senior levels. That's not the issue. The issue is the partisanship. And they thought that if we become just another influence group, then we're going to erode the confidence in our profession. Second, that if they allow the will of the profession to substitute for the will of the people's elected official, this could also erode confidence. Third, that if senior military leaders provide options that are only options that are favorable to the military profession, not for the common defense, then they thought that that might erode. And then last, if we don't maintain our ethic of apoliticality among the officer corps, they thought that these were ways that we could erode. They also thought that losing a war, where that loss is linked to military performance on the battlefield, or because of bad advice from senior leaders or being quiet from senior leaders, that losing a war could also erode confidence. And secondary to that, they thought that if we support methods or strategies, we meaning the profession as represented by senior military leaders, if they support methods or strategies that have proven not to work over time, without suggesting alternatives, that this would be seen as being party to wasting lives and wasting resources and would affect confidence in our profession. And then last, they thought if we allowed our ethical standards to decline by not cleaning our own house at every level, not enforcing the standards that whether they're senior leaders or mid-grade leaders or junior leaders, if you don't clean your house, this is also another way that we could erode. They also had some examples about the secondary, their secondary theme, and that is the way the profession is going. They thought that if we can create a warrior class, again, this is familiar, that sets itself above or better than the American people, this is a possible way we could erode confidence. Or if we take that support for the American people for granted, what's due to us because we are who we are. And then last, if we allow the public to come to the conclusion that their country would be better run if it was run more like a military organization, that could erode. So those were the answers to the major themes of the second question. What could we do? And then the last question I asked was, are there any indications? And again, they thought yes, that there were some indications. First, they thought that the apoliticality of the profession is already at risk in two ways. First, conversations and posts on social media, which is not a private space, is a public space that expresses partisan political discussions, even when they post, well, this is my private beliefs, not representative. That is like a nothing statement, because this informal poll that I took thought that the disclaimer meant absolutely nothing. That people are making conclusions about what, quote unquote, the profession believes, and the posts that are overly partisan erode a major norm. And second, they thought that senior retired military officers supporting or serving in civilian positions, if they cross through a threshold, now no one, they thought that there's some unknown threshold, and only a true political scientist can figure this out. You can leave it up to you guys, what that threshold is, but they thought, well, we may not have crossed it, but we may be approaching it. So that was a pretty common answer. Second, they thought the profession was, again, already at risk because we're creating conditions for a different norm, a norm of partisanship to take shape. And that we are turning a blind eye toward unprofessional and unethical behavior in some seemingly small ways, but still it's a step toward erosion of a norm. And then last, they thought that our ability is actually at risk. Our performance capacity is at risk because our self-reflection is not always reality-based. And a couple of the respondents said we sometimes lie to ourselves. And they thought this is really not good for a profession. And if you're going to have a profession that is a high-performing profession, it can't rest on this kind of. So that was their answer. In the second theme, they thought inbreeding has already begun, and they thought this was down the road, more than just crossing a little bit of a line of departure. That we are creating a class by the way we recruit and the way we acquire officers. They thought also that a creeping sense of entitlement that is eroding selflessness, an attitude of we and they, I served, I sacrificed, you didn't, you owe me. And they thought this was another instance of we're starting down a road that, away from our selfless service. And there was one other comment, that was it on my three questions, but there was one other comment that came up in quite a few of my respondents, and it had to do with the nature of the profession itself in the information age. And they acknowledge that all professions are eroding in the information age because information is available. And they thought that put a special emphasis on us as a profession to develop even a deeper and broader sense of our profession so that we would be able to retain what we have to as a profession. So that was the result of my informal poll. I know that the real political scientists, have to do research to figure out what is anecdotal and what is non-anecdotal. But I thought, again, it was pretty suggestive of at least the kinds of conversations that are going on among the profession, because my poll has some active and some retired officers from major to general. And so I thought it was at least reflective. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. And you are a very tough act to follow. I come before you as a former soldier a long time ago and a checkered background since then that includes law practice, service in the Pentagon as a civilian official, and work on 3 presidential campaigns. And I'm also the child of divorced parents. And you're probably asking yourself, why is that relevant? And it's relevant because of an old joke I heard growing up, which is 2 divorced parents' kids are sitting in the courthouse. One of them's crying, the other one's not. The crying one is crying because his parents are arguing over him for custody. And the other one says, well, at least your parents are arguing over you. And that comment, that joke, but it was a comment told to me by a teacher a long time ago, has stuck with me as a metaphor for civil-military relations too. that on the one hand, we argue a lot about it, but at least we're arguing, and at least we're engaging in a discourse and having a healthy conversation about roles and missions within the civil military ecosystem as compared to Pakistan or as compared to so many places around the world where there is no discussion, there's simply the rule of the gun, and we ought to be grateful, I think, every day that we live under our Constitution and we have this process for adjudicating these questions, which is not to say that there are no problems. And what I'd like to do as a lawyer is share a few observations as sort of mini case studies from the civil military landscape and suggest that these collectively argue for both the partisanization, if that can be made into a word, and the politicization of the military in unhealthy ways, with a few emerging norms of civil military behavior that have come about really in the last 15 months, but probably a longer period. So the observations begin with a number of examples of politicization happening within the military itself, sort of endogenous behavior by the military. Service chief posture statements, COCOM posture statements, budget submissions, and strategic documents of the Pentagon are all, I think, indicators of a political organization that has become, in many ways, a rent-seeking actor in the American political ecosystem. The military now lays claim to the largest share of the discretionary budget. It has its own policy preferences, its own budgetary preferences, and it is increasingly acting as a political actor in our domestic political sphere in ways that would have been unrecognizable before, but now exist because we have such a massive standing military establishment that is so important. Second, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and other senior military leaders on active duty, taking increasingly public and political role in national security debates and non-national security debates. And the examples that come forward are General Powell with his role on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and his Powell Doctrine. Admiral Mullen with his raising of debt as a national security issue. General Dempsey with lamenting the civil-military divide, but not just the military recruiting components of it, the societal components of it. On one level, these are totally appropriate. These all have a national security linkage. It is important for the chairman to consider these matters as he or she renders advice to the president. But on another level, they reflect an increasingly politicized role for even the active duty military in society. Third, reserve component lobbying of Congress on roles and missions. If the reserve component had their way, they would have 75% of the Army's force structure. They would also have every attack helicopter in the inventory. The use of NAUGUS and the governors and other cutouts and state adjutants general is an incredible example of political activity by active officers that talk about blurred lines. That's a great case study. Fourth, service chief statements after Charlottesville last August. The marching out of step by service chiefs was an important thing for them to do to maintain good order and discipline within the ranks, but it was striking in the extent to which it differed from the commander-in-chief, both in style, tone, and substance. It also echoes pushback on Force of the Future 2 years ago under the Obama administration, and more recently echoes the slow walking of the transgender policy by Secretary Mattis and the service chiefs over the last several months. That's now 5. And this is where I think we get to the exogenous forces on the military that are politicizing it from the outside. The use of the military as a prop in political campaigns. Guilty as charged. I did it during the Obama campaign. I put Wes Clark on the stage along with 24 other general officers. It has an effect. It is leading to the perception that there are Democratic generals and there are Republican generals. The political activity of retired generals is bleeding back into the active force. It is creating the perception, particularly when officers are active so soon after they retire, that they are reflective of the politics of the presidents and the administrations who appointed them. And there is some data, I think from Jim Goldby, maybe I have that site wrong, that suggests there are donation patterns which mirror that identification. Sixth, the highlighting of the military or veterans component of major political decisions like the Affordable Care Act or budgets to signal that a certain policy choice that has nothing to do with the military, or very attenuated thing to do with the military, is all about the military. So you've got to pass the omnibus, otherwise the troops will suffer. You've got to pass the Affordable Care Act, otherwise the veterans will suffer. Sort of national security-ification of issues is changing, I think, the political discourse and privileging, to Jim's point, the military voice above others in society and creating an entitlement complex which is at odds with the selfless service component of our ethos. And that relates to the national security-ification, again, to create an awful word that probably sounds better in German, of non-military issues. Obesity, gun control, STEM education, law enforcement, the war on drugs. How many military metaphors do we need in domestic politics? Why don't we just solve the issue? We don't need to militarize every issue. So that's just a landscape study, 8 discrete case studies to look at. I hope some law school will take this on in its next conference. I think this is leading us to emerging norms and evolving norms of civil military behavior that we ought to keep our eye on. One is the sort of emergence of a national security deep state consensus around certain issues that transcends administration and is arguably the sort of considered view of professionals, but it also reflects certain political preferences for continued war in Iraq and Afghanistan despite what politicians believe or what the political wills are. Sustainment of high levels of defense spending and sort of rejection of certain reform ideas because it's contrary to the kind of institutional consensus. And an institutional consensus around a global counterterror strategy that may or may not be in our interests. That's one. Second, an increased willingness of active and former military leaders to publicly march out of step with their president, whether it's on small issues like modernization or budget or big issues like the debt. Third, an acceptance of more political activity from our volunteer force. I think you and Heidi Urban are right that there is a great deal happening on social media, but there's a great deal happening outside of social media too. And I think we are accepting that at a time when we ought to be questioning it. And I think fourth, and most dangerously, we have codified the civil-military divide in important structural ways. We have a geographic, demographic, social, and recruiting component to the civil-military divide that it's become so institutionalized we're not going to do anything about it because there's no burning platform. And there's not going to be, I think, until we lose a war because of it. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan just doing well enough not to cause a crisis that causes us to fundamentally evaluate this system. A Task Force Smith, a Kasserine Pass, a Vietnam, something of that scale of disaster is necessary to cause us to rethink this, and I would hope that we would try to ask these questions before we get there and lose another war. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the West Point and the Institute for organizing this. This really is a terrific conference with real experts here. I have a couple, and I agree with much of what my previous panelists have said. I do have a little bit of differences before I get into the things I wanted to touch on. I don't think that, constitutionally speaking, the Constitution was built with the idea of preventing retired military officers from speaking out on political matters, or even the politicization of the Guard, even though I agree with everything that Phil was saying. It really was about the physical threat that professional military forces might present. And I think it was actually Dr. Tierney, and I correct me if I'm wrong, he wrote an op-ed about the Newburgh conspiracy, and if I'm remembering correctly, he said that pretty much ended, the way that was resolved, that pretty much ended the threat of a physical, actual military coup in the United States, and it was never embedded in the culture. So I would argue, or at least suggest, that some of the things that we see today that we are concerned about, and rightly so, in terms of civil-military relations, are not things that the founders would have been so concerned about, because they're all members of the militia. They were all saw themselves having a military role and a political role as well. I think it's important always to talk about military professionalism, but when we talk about the divisive political environment, I too am reading Grant's, the book on Grant, which is a tremendous document. And when you think about how divisive politics have been in the past and the politicization of the military in the past, it's pretty dramatic. And I think some people in the earlier in our history would think that what we see today is not anything like they went through in their period of time. And we heard a lot earlier about the militarization of the current administration. And my view has always been a handful of retired generals among 5,000 political appointees does not a coup of 2016 make, because it is a relatively small number, which has recently been diminished. But having said that, let me talk about a few of the things to put in context. You know, the public very much doesn't see a crisis in professionalism in the military. And I would invite your attention to a 2016 Harris poll that ranked being a military officer as one of the top 4 most prestigious professions in the United States. And ahead of them were doctor, scientist, firefighter. And people say, well, they don't know what the military is, and if they really knew the military, they weren't rated so highly, or some suggestion along that line. But I was thinking when one of our earlier panelists said that, how much do people really know about what a firefighter does, or what a scientist does, or even what a doctor does? I mean, people make these decisions and judgments on many different bases, but not necessarily because they have in-depth understanding. And also in 2016, a Pew Research Center poll showed that the military was considered by the public as most likely to act in the public interest. In 2017, we had the Gallup poll, which once again showed that the military was the most institution in American government in which people had the most confidence. And another Gallup poll from December of 2017 showed that military officers were second only to nurses in the public's perception of their honesty and ethics. And most recently, in March of 2018, just a few weeks ago, Lawfare, the blog Lawfare, has been conducting a poll, and this is a quote from it: "Once again, the military enjoys the highest level of public confidence of any government institution about the ability to protect national security." So, in other words, the public is very satisfied with the military professionalism. I would draw that from those polls. Notwithstanding, I think that there has been a cascade, an unrelenting cascade in the media of negative information about the military. So notwithstanding that, across parties, there nevertheless seems to be a lot of support for military professionalism. That doesn't mean, and I really want to foot stomp this, that we shouldn't be concerned about it. It's something that we have to constantly maintain. But the sky is not falling, and we should examine, and probably, you're right, General, we should have smart political scientists should look into that and really figure out what the public seems to value, what they're seeing, why is it. Now, one of the polls said is because of the perceived competency of the military. And along that line, I thought it was interesting that I think Richard Duhay, I'm probably mispronounced, Ross Duhay in the New York Times wrote an op-ed recently about, hey, we've had this victory over ISIS in Syria, and, quote, no one seems to even know about it. And what he explained is that the media doesn't want to promote that because they perceive that as aiding the current administration. And that doesn't fit with what he calls the narrative of Trumpian disaster in which our journalistic entities are all invested. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is a little surprising that there isn't more, outpouring. I do think that there are challenges for the public to get to know the military better. One of the things that we were asked to take a look at is how should active duty military officers interface with the public in terms of writing. I won't go through them. We can go through them during the Q&A, but years ago I wrote an article where I tried to come up with guidelines for officers on active duty as to what they should speak out on and how they should speak out on it. And I think it's inversely relationship to their rank, inversely relationship to a military operation. But I do think that there are guidelines out there, and inevitably, though, I think that we're going to have, especially junior officers and enlisted personnel, who are going to be on social media, and that's why I really want to hear the latest and greatest on that topic. And I do think that the answer is not a disciplinary system or something like that. It's building an ethos, and that's not original with me. That's original with Urban. Now, what about retired generals speaking out? I think conceptually, I and I've written on this, I don't like retired generals getting as actively involved in the partisan political activity like being at the conventions and so forth. But I do think that, that there is a place for retired generals to offer their expertise, you know, and I don't have anything other than anecdotal evidence, but in my experience, people pretty much know the difference between an active duty general officer and a retired one. And even at, you know, conferences like this, you know, I get emails to Dr. Dunlap or Mr. Dunlap or something like this. People don't, once you change that status, they respect it, but they know that you're no longer, and they do want to hear your expertise, such as it may be, but they put it in context, at least my anecdotal experience. So I'm not so much concerned about that. I am more concerned about the idea of alienating former members of the armed forces from the political process. And this is why I've never agreed with this idea, well, active duty officers shouldn't vote and so forth. Really? You really want to alienate them from the fundamental act of a democracy? What kind of mindset do you want to inject into officers that democracy really isn't important and that real officers aren't involved? You know, don't vote, don't make those hard decisions. And I read one thing where a person says, well, if you vote, then you have a mindset and you'll never. We all, professional military officers are always compartmentalizing their private feelings in relationship to their professional duties. Otherwise, you wouldn't send men and women into combat. Because wasn't it Lee or somebody said that, you know, or somebody said something like, to be a successful officer, you have to kill the thing you love, which is the troops. So you have to compartmentalize your personal feelings and be a professional when you need to be. I think something of that goes to, with respect to retirees, I think the public wants your expertise. And I think it's wrong in a democracy to have what I've said before, the silence of the generals. You really want to push them just to working behind the scenes because they're going to have opinions. They care about the institution, and they're going to be active. I'd rather have it out in the sunlight. General Hertling is, I appreciate what he does, even though I often don't agree with him, but at least it's out there in the sunlight, and we can then debate it. That's what democracy is. And to build a concept that excludes the military from, especially former military, from the political process, I think is unwise and not in the best interest of the United States. Now, one final thing, and then I'll shut up. You know, there is a concern about, and I think Phil has written on this, and really, and CNAS has done a fantastic job about this warrior caste. And I don't think it's, and there's this survey done that of 32 million young people in the cadre that we would want, there's only 136,000 of that 32 million who would be interested in joining the Army. And now, there were hundreds of millions that were interested in joining the Air Force, but you know, put that aside. But I think, but the reason that is that they didn't want to leave home. And I also think that when you look at other surveys of young people, I think part of the problem is not so much that they doubt the professionalism or don't like the organization. They're watching these TV shows that are about special forces and high-intensity combat, and they get this idea, oh my God, I can't do that. I can't be part of that. They don't really, so that's where I think we hurt ourselves in terms of getting young people into the military, because they really don't understand the many ways that they can serve. And I don't want to diminish at all the close combat function, but there are ways that they can serve consistent with what their abilities are. And I think that that's something that we need to do a better job at. And as you know, the Air Force has recently called a timeout in terms of public engagement. I think that that is a good idea, you know, to recalibrate, figure out what works, what doesn't work, to get the message out. Now, I'm one of the, I think probably the only person in this room maybe who thinks that a military, if not parade, some kind of military event, a major military event would be a good thing to help reorient, many people in our society to what the military is about. It may not be a parade, but maybe some kind of static displays on the mall. It would be an intense media event. The military already spends $575 million a year on advertising. So 10 or 15 or 20 or whatever number they're using to have some kind of major military event the last one was 1992, once every 26 years is probably not a bad thing. And I remember going to the one in 1992, and I was talking about this morning, an F-117 flew over, and I remember the person this guy stand with his young son, and he says, look, Bobby, we can see the stealth airplanes now, they're usually invisible, And so that's the kind of thing I think that we need to work on. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I was sitting here listening to my fellow panelists and struck by the thought that our panel is supposed to be talking about how military can retain its professionalism in a divisive political culture, and all 5 of us are veterans. And that was, I thought, a pretty important piece, that this conversation is still a little bit insular, and that I think is affecting the conversation quite a bit. I'd like to take, part of being the last person, I'd like to kind of take us in a different direction. Most of my fellow panelists were talking at a more abstract level about how to maintain this professionalism. I'd like to actually contextualize it in terms of the humans who are having to be professional. And I'm drawing on my last decade training troops, all 4 services, from General Dunford and his wife Ellen down to privates and very junior troops during their boomerangs between deployments. And a lot of what I'm talking about comes from my next book. But because of some of these constraints, it really can undermine the capacity to actually enact professional norms because of some of the emotions that it brings up, because of some of the coping behaviors that it brings up. And I think it highlights some of the ways that the military is increasingly out of touch with civilians, on the opposite side, that the civilians are increasingly out of touch with the military. There's clearly been an unequal burden over the last 18 years, and that has, I think, created a bit of a bifurcated understanding for the military, for the civilians. As the military has become insular and coping with, I think, a fair amount of both entitlement and the flip side of that, resentment. Those 2 things can go together. This is the first, these post-9/11 wars are the first wars that have been exclusively fought by a tiny all-volunteer force, 0.5% of the population, supplemented by a huge host of private military contractors. And as the costs panel and the overstretch panel, I'm sure we'll talk some about, this has meant that they have been doing some of the longest deployments since World War II. We have more than 90,000 troops who have deployed multiple times, with several of those troops deploying 4 or more times. And I've worked with many of these men and women. And the data show pretty consistently, as the deployment length increases, as the frequency of the op tempo increases, as the dwell time at home decreases, rates of depression, PTSD, lower sense of well-being, and increased resentment have all happened. It also leads to poorer adjustment during the next deployment and coming home after that next deployment. So there are these constraints on the humans who are having to be very professional. There's a large literature out there about the civil-military gap, but there's one piece of the gap that has not received much attention yet in political science and in, I think, much of the military, which is that in the all-volunteer force era, the people who are choosing to serve are being drawn disproportionately from backgrounds where they have suffered multiple adverse childhood experiences. Divorce, parent incarceration, sexual, physical, emotional abuse and neglect, substance abuse or alcoholism in their homes. Our force, the all-volunteer force, is being drawn disproportionately from these kinds of backgrounds compared to the civilian population. In civilian military comparisons during the draft era versus the all-volunteer force era, For men, across every single one of the categories of an ACE, there are more men serving with that experience than men who aren't. And ACE effects, the effects of these adverse childhood experiences, are additive. There's a disproportionate spread. About a third of the force has come from 4 or more of these kinds of experiences. The reason I'm highlighting this is it has a large effect on the way that the mind and body get wired from early childhood, and it can lead to difficulties with impulsivity, difficulties with emotion regulation, with stress, and higher aggression. And in line with these data, there's a lot of data from 2014, 2015 that show that the US Army has recruited in the post-9/11 era disproportionately from people who have ADHD, intermittent explosive disorder, pre-enlistment PTSD, panic disorder. All of these conditions are a particular mind-body system that then is having to do these multiple deployments. So there is kind of a path-dependent effect that I think can affect the way that men and women can then cope with what's going on. I think it shows up in some of the suicide data and the increase in both male and female veteran suicide data compared to civilian suicide data. It shows up in vulnerability to stress disorders after deployments. And there's a lot of empirical data showing that from many studies. There's also a higher survival rate during these wars, which means that there are more people coming home with more physical injuries, dismemberments, and losses of capacity than ever in the past. In the post-9/11 wars, 7.6 wounded to 1 death. In all previous wars up to 91, it was 1.6 wounded to 1 death. So there's just a lot more people surviving. And as a result, the #1 issue today is actually chronic pain, which helps to explain the high incidence of prescription drug use and abuse, both in theater and back at home. All of these things, on top of the code switching, as anthropologists call it, during the deployment, where I've worked with men and women who will, in a 4-hour period, go from kicking indoors to talking to and working with local populations to getting on Skype and talking to their family at home. That requires an immense amount of code switching. And the way to cope with all of these different things, the chronic pain, the psychological injuries, the code switching, is suppression and compartmentalization. But suppression and compartmentalization can make it very easy for us to disengage from our moral capacity. To be able to suppress that stress, those emotions, makes it hard for us to get in touch with our moral nature. And that kind of moral disengagement can show up in addictive behaviors, in unethical behaviors, which I think contributes to some of the moral injury that we have seen as one of the signature wounds in this era. It also contributes to self-medicating and addictive behaviors. So that's part of what's going on with the military, and they're bearing an unequal burden, and understandably there is some degree of resentment and isolation and sense that the civilians don't understand them. Data from the post-9/11 veterans show that 84% of them feel like the public doesn't understand the problems that they and their families have faced. There's similar data, 2/3 of veterans find the thank you for your service kind of surface public absolution of kind of conscience on the civilian side, find that to be very infuriating and isolating. Veterans of the post-9/11 wars are nearly twice as likely to veterans of other wars to say that they have found readjusting to civilian life to be very difficult. On the flip side, paired with the civilian high trust in the institution of the military, there's also this public perception, partly because of the media coverage, that troops are broken. Several surveys have shown that the dominant perception among civilians is that veterans are damaged or broken. 80% of civilians believe that the military and veterans have more mental health problems than your average civilian. And they believe, 2/3 of civilians believe, that the disproportionate burden that the military is shouldering during this era is just part of being in the military. It's kind of a complete disconnect from any obligation. So the sense of lack of civic-mindedness, lack of sense of service among the wider population creates this disconnect where the military has a right in some ways to feel more entitled. They're shouldering an unequal burden. And civilians on the other side are both, we respect you, but we really don't want to have anything to do with you, that kind of disconnect. So I think this isolation, resentment, and reliance on compartmentalization and suppression as a way to cope with what's going on can exacerbate some of the situations around making professional and ethical decisions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to the panelists for absolutely terrific, extremely rich comments. We're going to run over just a few minutes beyond 10, just because we started a little late, which will give a chance for more questions. We'll try and wrap up about 10:05. I'm going to restrict myself just to 3 questions, and I'll try and get a couple folks to chime in on each one. I've been asked to be a little provocative and stir the pot a little bit, so hopefully we can continue our interesting discussion. So my first question is to Phil and Elizabeth, and the question is about the legacy of 17 years of difficult warfare for the United States on this civil-military gap. Let me just flesh that out a little bit. Phil mentioned in his comments that the United States is, quote-unquote, doing well enough in some of its key wars. And it is true that the U.S. experience is not really parallel to Vietnam. But it is also true that the last 17 years have been extremely difficult for the United States in military terms. All 3 regime change missions that the U.S. has engaged in, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, turned into strategic stalemates or strategic failures. And if we look at history, difficult wars, losses can have a range of different effects on societies, a wide range of effects, from war weariness in some cases, to myths of a stab in the back in other cases, to also it can produce renewal and innovation and a focus on problems. Sometimes it takes failure and loss to produce that effect. So my question, and I'll ask Phil and Elizabeth this, do you think that the last 17 years of warfare and the thousands of casualties, the trillions of dollars spent, will ultimately have the effect of binding together the civil community and the military community? Or is it effectively driving a wedge between those groups? Perhaps Phil first.
Sure. So if only there was the conversation you just described, I think we'd be in a healthier place. But my observation is that senior military leaders and senior civilian leaders as well have a catechism about these wars that enables them to avoid the hard question, let alone the harder answer. And so we often hear, in fact, in Chairman Dunford's recent press releases from his trip to Afghanistan, significant military progress. Victory is at hand. General Nicholson, same sort of catechism. Secretaries Mattis, Secretaries Carter, Secretaries Hagel. We've asked our military to do hard things, and they've succeeded at everything that's been asked of them. And it reminds me of something that came a lot about in the Vietnam literature, which is that the Army tends to focus on winning battles, not wars. And the Army has embraced this narrative of we've fought and won every battle, and we've done well, but the nation is responsible for the larger loss. And until we reconcile that, or there's a forced reconciliation, I don't think we'll have the hard question or answer session that you described.
Yeah, thank you very much. Elizabeth.
I fully agree with Phil, and I think I would add that part of this compartmentalization that I was talking about can lead to disconnects at that from tactical to strategic level, but it can also, I think, lead to a sense of this wasn't our fault, we're going to double down and do our own piece, and look at all that we've shouldered as a result, so this wasn't our fault. It's a very similar dynamic that existed after Vietnam, and I think drove a large part of the Army's direction towards air land battle as a doctrine. Let's put away this part that isn't part of our preferred part of the conflict spectrum. We're shouldering these awful costs, and let's get back to doing real business. And so I think that's going to cause a further pull away. I think most civilians have not been particularly tracking what's going on, and so as a result, I'm not sure that they've drawn lessons at all, other than that the military can do it.
Right.
And so I think it's going to probably further exacerbate things, not cause the reuniting and the resynthesizing that is really needed.
Right, thank you. Jim, did you want to come in?
Well, just a short comment. I think your question really stems from a misunderstanding of what war is, not your misunderstanding, but reflective in our society. You can deploy military forces to end fighting, not to end wars. And fighting a war and waging a war are two different functions, and we have believed falsely for a long time that ending fighting equals ending wars, and so you're done. And that's a big conceptual error.
Thank you very much. Did you want to?
Just real quickly, I think that one of the issues here is that the public is happy with their strategic goal in the 17 years was pretty simple. We don't want another 9/11 in this country, and the military, in their view, has succeeded in delivering success in that way. So I don't see, to Phil's point, I do think that, you know, we need to have these discussions. I think the Army's doing a better job at self-reflection than maybe I'm underinformed, but I think that they are doing a better job of self-reflection. But I think the real issue, and what I tell my students, is that, yes, we've had 17 years of war, but we're going to have at least 17 more. The threat of transnational terrorism empowered by technology is not going to go away, and I would invite people's attention to Thomas Friedman's book, Thank You for Being Late, in which he elaborates on his point that technology is empowering, quote, one of us to be able to kill all of us. So that kind of devastating threat, which previously was the realm of the nation-state actor, has now devolved down to, in theory, even a single individual. So this is, people like to say we need an end of war. Well, you know, only the dead have seen the end of war, and I think that's particularly true in the modern age. So that's what I think we need to be concerned about.
Right, let me just ask another question, and Marybeth can perhaps go first on this, but others might be interested as well. So a point that was made, I think, by a couple folks on the panel is the remarkable degree of trust that the American public has in the military. And if you look over the last few decades, there has been declining trust in virtually every institution in the United States, from the media to the presidency, virtually without exception, other than the military. And so now the military sort of is the shining city on the hill almost. But my question, again, to be a little provocative, is to wonder, is this entirely healthy? To have such adulation of the military, almost as the sole institution that's seen in that way. For example, I can't think of another democracy where there is the same adulation. Just to give one illustration, this adulation may be a somewhat romanticized view of an institution that, as I think a couple people pointed out, that the public doesn't really understand or know very well. So on the one hand, the military has really earned this trust through incredible service, but I wonder if it is dangerous in some respects. Marybeth, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you for that question. And I couldn't help but think of someone, and I started out as a comparativist on civil-military relations, and not until I got to the War College 19 years ago did I really focus on U.S. And mainly that was because I was really shocked that what the 05s thought was passed for civil mil norms and didn't understand some of these constitutional things. But anyway, that lens is really useful because a lot of this language is the type of stuff, like I said in my remarks, that you read in The Man on Horseback. And if you understand coups, in my civil mil elective, I always do a block on how coups happen and how does that happen. And it has to do, all these factors are things like, you know, the public, and it's because civilians ask them to come in, because right. The civilians, and because of an underperformance of the civilian institutions. So part of what goes on with your question is, about this is trust and the declining trust in other institutions, I think that is dangerous because we don't want the military filling the void, because every time they step in, it's just kind of like our work abroad, with the development and everything else. When they step in, they're filling that space that should be filled by competent and respectful civilian institutions. So I think there's a little bit of that going on right now. So keep that in mind, because that's how these things happen. Other parts of the language is, we're apolitical, we know better, we have the national interest at heart. That's great, but it's not your role to determine the national interest. That's why we have elected officials. So I think there's a lot of this kind of conflation of the roles. And again, when I first really looked at this firsthand with my work hall students, it was this thinking that because we're competent, we should get our way. And because they're incompetent, we should get our way. So it's a lot of the same thing, and I don't think it's really changed that much in the last 2 decades, but a little amplified a little bit more in the current administration.
Thank you very much. Did anyone else want to?
Just real quickly, I think there's a thirst among the American people to have something in government that works.
Right.
And I think that the military is filling that. And I do think, in my experience, admittedly anecdotal, that when members of the public meet the troops,
Yep.
they are unbelievably impressed. And I'm not talking just about, an elite special forces. I'm talking about a two-striper who shows up because they do look good. They are polite. There are a lot of things that people want to see in society. But in my mind, it is troubling that the military is the institution in our society in which the public has most confidence, greatly exceeding that accorded to the other instruments of civilian control, to include the Supreme Court, to include the presidency, and to certainly Congress. And that has to trouble us on some level. We want the military, people have confidence in the military, but to so exceed all the instruments of civilian control, troubling.
Elizabeth.
I have 2 points. One is, in some ways, we as a nation keep creating this through a vicious cycle. We don't fund the other instruments of power,
Right.
and we overfund the Department of Defense. Right. And then when something needs to happen, the question is, well, they're going to do it because no one else has any capacity left. And so there's been, at a policy level, this kind of vicious cycle that makes it worse and worse. But I think at a more personal and I think semi-conscious level, in the same way that the entitlement that Jim was talking about has underneath it some resentment and isolation, I think that on the civilian side, the adulation, romanticization, underneath it has a degree of shame. I had this very interesting conversation yesterday with my driver coming back from the train station. He spent 39 years as a postal service maintenance guy. His wife drives a bus. And we had this amazing conversation about what the military is. And what really struck me in so many of his comments were, and I've heard this from other people too, the military does things the rest of us just can't do. And as a result, they're the only ones capable of doing anything. Right. They're the ones putting themselves in harm's way. They can do it, no one else can.
Right.
Can I add just one thing to that? Because the way these coup cases always end is that, because the military gets into things beyond its military expertise, it invariably doesn't have the background to do it and invariably does not do well. And that, of course, has a negative effect on this high prestige institution, which is what got it sucked into it in the first place. So you have to, read the rest of the story, because there really aren't good examples of the branching out, into other aspects of government, and plus there's very little the military could do by itself in anything these days anyway, when you think about it, compared to a, developing country in Africa in the 1960s or something like that, when maybe you really could take over certain things and this and that. So, just be aware of all that kind of talk.
Sure. So I just have one last question. And if declining trust in American institutions is one sort of feature of American society, another is polarization and the way in which issues are increasingly being seen through a partisan lens. And in fact, there's a whole host of issue areas that were formerly fairly bipartisan and are now viewed very differently by Republicans and Democrats. To give you just a few illustrations, Russia, Israel, the NFL, the Oscars, right? One issue after another is now sort of falling into this partisan way of thinking. So my question, and anyone can chime in here, in a sense, it would be remarkable if the US military somehow avoided this fate, given how many other issues seem to be viewed in a partisan way. So what do you see as the prospects for retaining sort of bipartisan support for the military? Is it plausible, for example, that at some point the Republican Party will be seen as the pro-military party and the Democratic Party as the clearly anti-military party? Alternatively, is it outside the realm of possibility that the Republican Party will see parts of the military as part of the deep state and sort of have a more skeptical, antagonistic relationship? I mean, who would have thought the Republicans would be so skeptical about the FBI, right, a few years ago? So things can change quite quickly. So do you see, looking ahead, that the military will avoid this trap of being seen in partisan terms, or will it be the next issue area to sort of fall into this tribalism? Would anyone want to chime in?
So there's this great Tufte-esque graphic that shows the evolution of American parties over time, and I think we're at one of these inflection points where we're about to see a major fracturing and realignment of political parties driven by President Trump, the post-9/11 wars, the national debt, the emergence of the Tea Party, and so many other factors. And so it's, I think, to fight your hypothetical, too early to tell where the military establishment comes down and how it cleaves. My sense is that with a self-selecting all-volunteer force, the military will increasingly reflect the demographics of the slice of society from which it is drawn, and that is, overly represented from the South and the Midwest, a little over rural than urban, and a few other characteristics, but it's largely going to reflect society. The bigger question is, what happens to society? We're probably beyond the bipolar, bipartisan moment into something much more fragmented, and the 2020 and 24 elections should give us a good perspective on what comes next.
Well, I probably have less of a coherent answer than Bill just offered, but part of the reason I asked the questions I did was reflected of a view that the future does not resemble the past, and that the future could be different. And it could be different for a variety of with respect to our profession. Some external may be beyond our control, but some internal. And so we ought not look at our profession and its justified, I think, good standing with respect to the American people, and suppose that's going to be forever. And that there are some things that are within our control, the profession's control, that may have a positive or negative effect.
Can I just add one thing on that? So your question is, Republicans pro-military, and might it evolve to the Democrats being anti-military? And the problem is they're both too pro-military, to where they're not getting real oversight, and getting a pass in the budget, and even civilian control things with regard to overseeing the wars, and just being kind of absent in all of that. So it's a different kind of problem, which doesn't help. I mean, as I was trying to say in my remarks, the civilians have a responsibility for monitoring the profession. So hands off isn't monitoring.
Great. Thank you for those incredibly insightful responses. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A. I think if you turn your name card over, or you can put your hand up, whatever you like, I'll point you out. Does anyone have a question? Yes, please. Different panelists have different ideas about what's changed in terms of military relations and what it's been a breakdown in the norms that we need. But most people agree that the point of objective military control is not really in the United States. It's been a coup to protect the military from that blood, politics,
have its reputation hurt. Point of objective military control is to protect the military, not just protect the country. So if indeed there are these breakdowns that some of you mentioned, to the extent they're new or have lasted a while, why hasn't there been more erosion of the military's popularity in the country, or is that still coming? Are the erosion of civil military norms if they're happening, is there a consequence that's going to be felt in terms of the military's reputation? Is the public perception of the military unsustainable if people are getting involved in politics and being seen as political actors as part of the very unpopular political fray?
If I could sound a slightly optimistic note on that topic, because logically what you say, should diminish the popularity, but we don't seem to have seen that. And I think maybe we're underestimating the public. I think the public knows, especially vis-a-vis active and retired, for example, the differences. I think that they understand more than maybe we appreciate that the military serves multiple administrations. And maybe we're underestimating the public in that regard. That's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about these internal things that could eventually over time erode. But I am concerned about the black swan kind of thing that could really change, the perception of the military in some dramatic way. I'm not quite sure what that would be. And given that we're dependent on an all-volunteer force, which requires us to get a good chunk of the best and brightest of the young people, that could be a very serious development if we lost that, and had to revert to a draft or something else to get the people we need.
All right. Any more questions? Yeah, please.
Yes. Max Brooks.
There's a mic coming.
I was working on a show Saturday Night Live during 9/11, and we all waited for President Bush's speech, asking us to contribute as citizens. We were told to pray, hug our kids, and participate in the economy. And that hasn't changed with any other administration. At no point have the American people been asked to contribute or sacrifice in any way in accordance with their own defense. What I'd like to know from you, in your opinion, is this gap that we have between the American people and those tasked with protecting them, how much of it is reticence on the part of the citizenry, and how much of it is, I would say, cowardice on the part of the civilian leadership to ask of the citizenry to support the military?
That's a very hard question. And I think the wonk in me wants to respond with a blame on Congress and its mechanism of financing wars through debt as the culprit here, because the American people have spent a lot, but it'll be paid for by our grandchildren's grandchildren on their credit cards. And I think had we not had the ability to deficit spend as a federal government, and the burden for these wars and these decisions have been felt by this generation, and they then felt the bite on their social programs or other things that they deeply cared about, we would have seen less of a moral hazard in decision making. We would have seen more direct political engagement with these issues. But the reality is the burden's being felt by those of you in room wearing uniforms and your families, and we are not going to pay for that burden until we're long dead. And I think that is the root problem here. And I think a constitutional amendment to eliminate the ability of the federal government to deficit spend would be one idea. Think of other mechanisms that could force that decision, but we've got to be able to pay for our decisions in the lifetimes that we make them.
I agree with Phil, but I do think that there's, and I'm getting out of my area of expertise, but that never stops me. Because remember, the military budget, of the whole budget, is only 14% of the budget. And we have things in our budget that no other country has in our budget. For example, my wife's health care as a retired officer is paid out of the DoD budget. I can't tell you how many civilians think that the Veterans Administration pays my retired pay or my wife's health care or something like that. And then even at Duke University, I can tell you only a tiny scintilla of people understand that Duke gets $75 million a year from the Department of Defense budget for various R&D activities. And so I think that there is a little bit of that. I do, but you raise a really good question. It would be nice to have senior leaders on the civilian side get up and say, join the military. Ask people to do that. I remember Secretary Gates came down to Duke in 2010, and he made that plea, especially with respect to elite universities. Didn't have any effect. The number of people going, Duke does have all the ROTC detachments, but they're mostly filled by students from North Carolina Central University, which they partner with. And I think there's maybe 2 or 3 veterans undergrads at Duke. There's about 300 vets, but they're mostly in the business school and the grad school. So I think, I think you're absolutely right. People do need to be asked to sacrifice. And I also agree with Phil that part of the forum for that ought to be in Congress. And I would even bring it down, I think we're gonna have a later panel on this, about a discussion about the AMF, because, what we're doing needs to be part of the national discussion. And when you have that national discussion and you invite people to contribute in different ways, I think that's good for democracy and civil-military relations. But if they're not asked, they think they're not wanted.
I think, Max, I think you're talking about this obligation of service. I think there was a real missed opportunity at that time when people really did want to do something, and that generation is sort of a service-oriented generation, and not to, give them something to do. So I think we need to be more creative about how we define, and not so much military service, because there actually are so many slots in the military, but national service, and think more broadly about instruments of power and how people can plug in and how that make that an expectation of citizenship and all that. So we're going to talk about Huntington next panel, but Janowitz was all about civic republicanism and thinking that citizenship, and I think our founders also thought that, because it was just assumed that everybody would be involved in their own defense. And, Liz cited this poll, I'm pretty sure it was the Pew 2011 War and Sacrifice since 9/11. Very troubling poll, which I think was really a turning point in my mind, where the public now thinks this is something we can just pay other people to do, and somehow everything will work out. We don't mind that big price tag, and it's nothing they have to worry about. So again, Baltic states. That's all. Take some lessons
can we
from
draw
them.
some? I don't want to be a Pollyannish here, but can we draw some encouragement from the demonstrations that we saw the past weekend, where young people on their own have generated? We may not agree with what they want and all this other kind of stuff, but they are getting together and self-generating something about their own defense. Mm-hmm. In other words, there seems to be a thirst out there. They want to contribute. They understand that security is important. It's where is the leadership to help them express themselves and help them to go forward?
Yeah, holding their Democratic leaders accountable. Yeah, it was very positive percent.
Jim, did you want to?
Yeah,
and then Liz.
Thanks for the question. I think, from my perspective, we have never understood that we're at war. That we went into this multi-year activity believing falsely that we could fight a few decisive battles and go home victorious. Even though there's a lot of voices that have said that was not going to be the case. But I think that was going in our position, or going in position. If that's the going in position, you don't plan on creating a fiscally responsible way to wage a war. You put it on a credit card. You don't legitimately energize the population to create support for the war. You keep them at arm's length. And while we get a lot of reporting on the war, the reporting is on tactical eaches, not reporting on the fact that we've been at war for 17 years and have not accomplished a strategic aim other than not being attacked again. No other strategic aim is being. We don't want to have that discussion. So our legitimate support for the war has been based on, I think, keeping the cost away from the American people and the understanding of the kind of war we're in and why it's important to fight off the discussion of the population.
Great. Liz.
I think, though, from a longer trend, this is just another example of the imbalance that exists with the two civilian masters. The military is the agent that responds both to the executive branch and the Congress. Congress has never declared war since World War II. So there's been a complete kind of abdication in some ways from the congressional branch, the legislative branch, doing its oversight role. And since Congress is also the one that controls the purse, if they're not fully stepping in and owning and taking a stand that, yes, no shit, this is a war, we're declaring it, we're also going to have money, and we're going to make sure that we mobilize the population. So I think that that's a deeper imbalance that's sort of been structurally developing for many decades, and we're seeing it play out at alarming cost right now.
Great. We have time for probably just one more question. The back, yes, sir.
My name's Major Matt Kavanagh. I'm a fellow here. And actually, civil military relations is not something that I was ever naturally interested in. I was sitting in a headquarters during the last presidential campaign in Korea and watching the presidential debates with a group of other officers, and you could just see the sort of partisan invective coming off the screen and then dividing people in the room. I had a Mexican-American officer that I was working with a lot, and you can imagine that some of the commentary had an effect on him. When I returned to the US from that assignment, I went to a headquarters in Colorado where when I arrived at my government desk, pretty much every other day I would get a robocall for campaign contributions to a particular political party, which is something that you wouldn't expect in a government headquarters where you wouldn't expect to be solicited for campaign contributions. So it was sort of these little instances that drove me to start digging into where we are and reading Lieutenant Colonel Golby's work and Colonel Urban's work, their survey data, and then looking back over time from the early 90s where we had one retired military officer offering a presidential endorsement to today where in the 2012 cycle I think there were almost 500. In this last cycle there were about a little bit less than 200. And to prepare for this conference, I read Richard Cohn's remarks from 1999 at the Air Force Academy. And it was a litany of how bad things were in the 1990s. And objectively speaking, things are clearly have trended worse. I mean, just numerically, I mean, I know that the survey data is, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics, but that's part of what prompted me, by the way, to make the argument that officers shouldn't vote, which we disagree on, sir. It's good to meet you. By the way, we can agree on Krzyzewski, right? So I'm sorry about last night. We feel that
Oh my
together.
goodness, there aren't horns growing out of your head.
No,
so
no. My mom can't see him at least. But my question is, you know, at what point should we, you used the, sir, you said we should be concerned, but not sort of terrified maybe. When should we freak out? You know, when are we, Cohn's, one of his final remarks was, certainly there is no crisis. What is the red line? When are we at a crisis? And then, you know, knowing that that might be ahead of us, how do we roll back some of these trends that, you know, how do we get the man off the horseback? So,
Please, Jim.
I'll just start off it. And again, the way I asked the questions of my informal polling group suggests my approach. Look, don't wait for the crisis. We are already seeing, first of all, we already acknowledge that there are things that we in the profession could do to erode the confidence and trust the American people have in us. That's the first, that's a good thing to acknowledge right off the bat. Second, there are activities at every level, not just the senior levels, at every level that have already begun to go down some of these paths. One of the things I really loved about our profession and still do is that we are the profession. It's not they, it's all of us. And that each of us at various levels have responsibilities to the profession. And it's certainly the case that the higher you go in rank, the more those responsibilities expand. But it is also certainly the case the lower you go, you still find them. So the discussion about voting is a legitimate company grade kind of discussion. the discussion about the social media posting and conversations. That's certainly a company level discussion, among others. So I'm not one to wait for a crisis. We see these trends within the profession starting to emerge. We can take corrective action at a variety of levels to kind of restrain them. You're not going to eliminate them, but you can restrain them. If remaining apolitical in the partisan politics sense is a norm we want to retain, then don't assume they are going to do that. We are the professionals, and we have to take action. Go ahead, John.
Great question, and I do agree with the general, but as Professor Ulrich, or Dr. Ulrich talked about earlier, I think the real red line is when the military starts to drift away from what the Supreme Court tells us is the mission of the military, to fight and win the nation's wars. And I'm concerned, as I put in my Code 2012 article from 1992, I'm afraid that because of the popularity of the military, that they're going to start asking us to do more and more things. And that will inevitably politicize the military, because they are political judgments that are embedded in there, and that's what really concerns me. Right now, ops tempo and so forth, we can slough off some of those things, but as we need to fix the State Department so that they can be doing things that are falling into the military's lap. I don't think it's a good example to foreign countries that, you know, when we go in and the military digs a well or is building a political structure in another country, it's done by uniformed military officers, because it imprints this notion on people who are vulnerable to impressions that, oh, it's people in uniforms that get things done. That's not what America is, but that's what the face of America too often is. And then when those young captains, you know, there was a book about Vietnam. It was called Once a Warrior King, about a young captain who went to Vietnam and was trying to build up a village, and we saw a lot of that trying to be done in Iraq and Afghanistan. What happens when those young officers come back and they're used to having what is in essence political authority? I think it's hard to go back into garrison and just be a cog in the machine. So I think that we need to build up our other capacities so that the military can focus on what the American people and what the Supreme Court tells us is the core mission. The more we deviate from that, and just let me say one thing about your op-ed. I do admire you for doing it, because I disagree with you vehemently, but you had the moral courage to do it because that's what you thought was the right thing. And there is an element. I just wish we had talked before you hit send on that. So,
I would, with maybe briefly, with apologies to Jeff Foxworthy, share 4 observations that if you have a 3-star retired general going on stage and saying lock her up at the Republican National Convention, you might have a civil military crisis. If DOD loses successive requests to get BRAC reinstated because of congressional political parochialism, you might have a civil military crisis. When you lose successive court cases because the AUMF is so anachronistic thanks to congressional inaction, you might also have a different kind of civil military crisis. And when you cannot make recruiting numbers for 4 years in a row, as the Army did at the height of the Iraq War, without lowering standards, you might have a different kind of civil military crisis. We have crossed so many red lines and done nothing. And I think the only thing saving us has been the military's ability to, in a Chomsky-esque way, manufacture consent. That we're beyond the point of worrying. We have to do some pretty radical action now to fix these things, and I worry that we're not talking about it enough.
And I would just like to add one thing to that. It goes back to the role of education. Let's see what would happen if we actually emphasize this and the military understood the norms, and don't forget, and the civilians understood their side of it as well. But there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. We don't have an officer corps that is well versed in this, and we don't have civilians in the relevant positions that are well-versed in this. So it seems like this is something that we can definitely work on. And a lot of us are educators, and that's a lot of what we try to do, but maybe brainstorm on how this can have a greater impact.
Great. Please join me in thanking this terrific first panel.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a 15-minute break while we get our VTC set up and wait for our next moderator.